The birthday cake sat untouched on the kitchen table, 85 candles crowding its surface like a small forest of flickering light. Margaret Winter stared at the flames, watching them dance and bend in the draft from the half-open window, their golden glow reflecting in her pale blue eyes. Outside, the October wind rustled through the oak trees, carrying with it the scent of rain and dying leaves, a smell that always reminded her of endings. "Make a wish, Grandma," her granddaughter Sophie chirped from across the table, her smartphone already raised to capture the moment. At 23, Sophie documented everything, as if life only existed when filtered through a screen and shared with strangers. Margaret's weathered hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. Not from age, though her body carried 8.5 decades of wear, but from something else entirely. Something that had been building inside her for exactly 10 years, 3 months, and 17 days. The silence had become a living thing. It had roots that wound through her chest, wrapped around her heart, squeezed her lungs until some morning she woke gasping for air. 10 years of carrying words that wanted desperately to be spoken, swallowing them back down every single day like bitter medicine. "Mom, are you okay?" Her daughter Catherine leaned forward, concern creasing her forehead. "You look pale." Margaret managed a smile, the same smile she'd perfected over the past decade, the one that said everything is fine while her soul screamed the opposite. "Just thinking about how fast time goes," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening beneath her skin. But that was a lie. Time hadn't gone fast at all. The last 10 years had crawled by like wounded soldiers, each day a battle between speaking and staying silent, each night a war with her own conscience. She closed her eyes and blew out the candles in one long breath. The room erupted in applause, her daughter, her granddaughter, her son-in-law Robert, and even Mrs. Delgado from next door who never missed a celebration. They thought she was wishing for health, perhaps, or more years, or the simple pleasures elderly women were supposed to want. They had no idea. Margaret opened her eyes to find everyone staring at her with expressions of love and expectation. Good people. Kind people. People who would be shattered by the truth. "What did you wish for, Grandma?" Sophie asked, already typing something on her phone, probably updating her followers about her grandmother's adorable birthday celebration. "I wished for the courage to finally speak," Margaret thought. "I wished for this silence to end, even if it destroys everything we've built." But what she said was, "That's a secret, sweetheart. Wishes don't come true if you tell them." Another lie to add to the mountain she'd constructed over the past 10 years. Catherine began cutting the cake, lemon with buttercream frosting, Margaret's favorite, and the conversation shifted to mundane things. Sophie's new job at the marketing firm. Robert's promotion. Mrs. Delgado's grandson's acceptance to medical school. Normal life, flowing around Margaret like water around a stone. She felt herself disappearing into that familiar numbness, the protective shell she'd built to survive each day. But then something caught her eye, a flash of movement through the window. A car had pulled up across the street. A black sedan with tinted windows, idling at the curb. Margaret's heart seized. It couldn't be. Not today. Not after all this time. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that caught the streetlight. He stood there for a moment, looking directly at her house, and even from this distance, even after 10 years, Margaret recognized him. The fork slipped from her fingers, clattering against her plate. "Grandma?" Sophie's voice seemed to come from very far away. The man began walking toward her front door. 10 years of silence. 10 years of secrets. 10 years of choosing protection over truth. And now, somehow, the past had found her. Margaret pushed back from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I need some air," she managed to say, though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "But you haven't even had any cake," Catherine protested. Margaret was already moving toward the hallway, toward the front door, her pulse hammering in her throat. Behind her, she heard Sophie say, "Is someone at the door?" I think I heard something. The doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, and Margaret froze mid-step, her hand outstretched toward the doorknob. Everything she'd buried was about to claw its way back to the surface. And this time, there would be no more hiding. What do you think Margaret has been hiding for 10 years? Drop your theory in the comments below. I'm curious what secret you think could be worth a decade of silence, ***. Margaret's hand hovered over the doorknob, her entire body frozen in a moment that felt suspended outside of time. Behind her, she could hear Catherine's chair scraping back, footsteps approaching. "Mom, I'll get it," Catherine said, her voice carrying that familiar note of concern mixed with mild exasperation, the tone daughters used when they thought their mothers were becoming fragile. "No." The word came out sharper than Margaret intended. She turned to face her daughter, forcing her expression into something resembling calm. "I've got it. It's probably just Mrs. Delgado's son picking her up." But Mrs. Delgado was still in the dining room, and they both knew it. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Margaret opened the door before Catherine could protest further, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the door nearly closed behind her, creating a barrier between her past and her present. The man standing on her doorstep looked older than she remembered, but then again, 10 years had passed. 10 years that had carved deeper lines around his eyes, silvered his hair completely, added a weariness to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. But his eyes, those dark, intense eyes, were exactly the same. "Hello, Margaret," Detective James Harrison said quietly. His voice was rough, like gravel and smoke. "I know I'm probably the last person you expected to see." Margaret's fingers gripped the porch railing so hard her knuckles went white. "You shouldn't be here." "I know." He glanced past her at the door, lowering his voice even further. "But something's happened. Something you need to know about." "After 10 years?" Margaret's voice shook despite her best efforts. "After 10 years of nothing, you show up on my birthday?" James had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I didn't know it was your birthday. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't urgent." He pulled a folded newspaper from his jacket pocket, extending it toward her. "This ran in today's paper. Page 7. Margaret didn't want to take it. Taking it meant acknowledging him, acknowledging the past, acknowledging everything she'd worked so hard to bury. But her hand moved of its own accord, fingers closing around the newsprint. She unfolded it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the article James had circled in red ink. "Local developer plans demolition of riverside warehouses." The words blurred as Margaret read, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. The article detailed plans by Sterling Development Corporation to tear down the old warehouse district along the riverside, the same warehouses that had stood abandoned for decades, the same warehouses where... "No," Margaret whispered. "They break ground in 2 weeks," James said. "Once they start tearing down those buildings, Margaret, they're going to find." "Stop." Margaret's hand shot up, silencing him. "Don't say it. Don't you dare say it out loud." Through the front window, she could see Sophie's silhouette moving in the dining room. Her beautiful, innocent granddaughter who knew nothing about the darkness that lived in her grandmother's past. Catherine appeared beside Sophie, and Margaret could see her daughter pointing toward the front door, clearly curious about who had arrived. "You need to leave," Margaret said urgently. "Now. We need to talk about this," James insisted. 10 years ago, you made me promise to stay silent. I kept that promise, even though it nearly destroyed my career. But this changes everything. When they start excavating." "James, please." Margaret's voice broke on his name, and she hated herself for it. Hated the weakness, hated the fear, hated how easily 10 years of carefully constructed walls could crumble at the sight of one man and one newspaper article. "I need time to think." "We don't have time." 2 weeks, Margaret." The front door opened behind her, and Catherine stepped out onto the porch. "Mom. Is everything okay?" Her eyes moved to James, taking in his rumpled jacket, the intensity of his expression, the way Margaret was gripping the newspaper like a lifeline. Who is this? Margaret's mind raced, searching for a lie, any lie that would make this moment make sense. But she'd told so many lies over the past 10 years that they'd started to tangle together, a web she could barely navigate herself. An old friend, James said smoothly, extending his hand to Catherine. James Harrison. I knew your mother many years ago. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to say hello. Catherine shook his hand, but her eyes were sharp, suspicious. She'd inherited that from her father, God rest his soul, that ability to sense when something wasn't quite right. That's quite a coincidence, showing up on her birthday. Catherine, Margaret said, her voice sharper than intended. Don't be rude. I'm not being rude. I'm being cautious. Catherine turned back to James. How exactly did you know my mother? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Margaret could see the calculation happening behind her daughter's eyes. Catherine was a lawyer, trained to spot inconsistencies, to pull at threads until entire stories unraveled. We worked together, James said carefully. A long time ago. Worked together? Mom, you were a librarian for 40 years. Before that, Margaret interjected quickly. Before you were born. It was just a temporary job, nothing important. Another lie. But what was one more at this point? Catherine looked between them, clearly unsatisfied with the explanation but uncertain how to push further without seeming paranoid. Finally, she said, well, we're in the middle of Mom's birthday celebration. Maybe this reunion could happen another time. Of course, James said. But his eyes never left Margaret's face. I just needed to deliver something. He gestured to the newspaper still clutched in Margaret's hands. There's an article I thought she'd find interesting. About the old neighborhood. Right, Catherine said, her tone making it clear she didn't believe a word of it. The old neighborhood. James turned to leave, but paused at the top of the porch steps. It was good to see you again, Margaret. We should catch up properly sometime. Talk about old times. He pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. My number. In case you want to, reminisce. Margaret took the card with numb fingers, watching as James walked back to his sedan. He didn't look back, just climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb, taillights disappearing into the October darkness. Mom, Catherine said slowly, her lawyer voice fully engaged now. What was that really about? Margaret folded the newspaper carefully, tucking it under her arm along with James's business card. It's nothing, sweetheart. Just an old acquaintance paying his respects. You're shaking. I'm 85. I'm always shaking. Don't do that. Don't deflect. Catherine moved closer, and Margaret could smell her daughter's perfume, something floral and expensive that Robert had probably bought her for their anniversary. Who was that man, really? And don't give me another vague answer. For one terrible, tempting moment, Margaret almost told her. Almost opened her mouth and let 10 years of secrets come spilling out right there on the front porch. Almost relieved herself of the crushing weight she'd been carrying for so long. But then she looked at her daughter's face, the face she'd watched grow from infant to child to woman, the face that looked so much like her own had at that age, and she couldn't do it. Couldn't shatter the image Catherine had of her mother, the respectable librarian widow who'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life. Just someone from a long time ago, Margaret said softly. Before you were born. Before your father. It doesn't matter now. If it doesn't matter, why do you look like you've seen a ghost? Because I have asterisk, Margaret thought. Because the past isn't past, and the dead don't always stay buried, and some secrets have a way of clawing back to the surface no matter how deep you try to bury them, asterisk. But what she said was, I'm just tired, Catherine. It's been a long day. Catherine studied her for a long moment, and Margaret could see the internal debate happening, push harder or let it go. Finally, her daughter sighed. Okay. But Mom? If something's wrong, if you need help with anything. I know, sweetheart. I know. They went back inside, where Sophie had already started posting birthday photos to her various social media accounts and Robert was pouring wine. Mrs. Delgado was regaling them with a story about her grandson's first day of medical school rotations. Everything was normal, safe, ordinary. Margaret cut herself a slice of cake she had no intention of eating and listened to the conversations flowing around her. But her mind was elsewhere, back in a warehouse district she tried so hard to forget, back in a single night 10 years ago when she'd made a choice that had seemed impossible at the time but inevitable in retrospect. A choice that was about to come back to haunt her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text message. Margaret pulled it out with shaking hands. Unknown number, we need to meet. Tomorrow. I'll explain everything. The coffee shop on Morrison Street, 10 a.m. Please, Margaret. This can't wait. Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then looked up to find Sophie watching her with curious eyes. Everything okay, Grandma? You look worried. Margaret forced a smile and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Just fine, darling. Just fine. But nothing was fine. Nothing had been fine for 10 years. And in 2 weeks, when the demolition crews started tearing down those warehouses, the whole world would know exactly why. Margaret looked around at her family, her daughter, her granddaughter, her son-in-law, even Mrs. Delgado who'd become like family over the years. All of them blissfully unaware that their lives were about to change forever. She'd kept silent for 10 years to protect them. But maybe, she was starting to realize, her silence had only been protecting herself. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay in her bed, the same bed she'd shared with her late husband Thomas for 47 years before cancer took him 8 years ago, and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows shift and dance as car headlights passed outside her window. The newspaper article sat on her nightstand, folded open to that damning headline. She'd read it 17 times since coming upstairs, memorizing every word, every detail, as if repetition would somehow change the reality of what was coming. Sterling Development Corporation. Luxury condominiums. Riverside Revitalization Project. Groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for November 7th. 14 days. Margaret reached for the bottle of pills on her nightstand, the ones her doctor had prescribed for anxiety after Thomas died. She'd barely touched them in years, but tonight she'd taken 2, then 3, desperate for sleep that wouldn't come. Her phone lit up with another text message. The 4th one from James since she'd gone upstairs. James ***, please respond. We need to talk before tomorrow, ***. James ***, I know you're scared. I am too. But we can't ignore this, ***. James ***, Margaret, I kept your secret for 10 years. Trust me one more time, ***. James ***, 10 a.m. Morrison Street. Please, ***. Margaret's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a dozen responses forming and dissolving in her mind. Finally, she typed a single word. Margaret **OK. She set the phone down and closed her eyes, but instead of darkness, she saw that night 10 years ago playing out behind her eyelids like a movie she couldn't stop watching. Margaret had been 75 then, recently retired from the library, trying to figure out how to fill the endless days that stretched before her. Thomas was still alive but declining, the cancer eating away at him piece by piece. Catherine was busy with her law practice, rarely visiting. Sophie was just 13, absorbed in the self-centered drama of adolescence. Margaret had felt invisible. Irrelevant. A ghost haunting her own life. That's when she'd started volunteering at the community center downtown, teaching reading to adults who'd never learned. It was there she'd met Elena Rodriguez, a 42-year-old woman with kind eyes and rough hands who cleaned office buildings at night to support her 3 children. Elena had become more than a student. She'd become a friend, perhaps Margaret's only real friend in years. They'd meet twice a week, working through children's books and simple novels, and Elena would tell stories about her life, stories of crossing the border alone at 17, of working 3 jobs to send money home to her mother in Guatemala, of her dreams for her children to have the opportunities she'd never had. And then Elena had stopped coming to class. A week went by. Then 2. Margaret had called, texted, even stopped by the apartment building where Elena lived with her family. Nothing. The neighbors said they'd moved suddenly, in the middle of the night, but something about the way she said it, nervous, avoiding eye contact, made Margaret's instincts flare. She'd gone to the police. Detective James Harrison had taken her statement, his expression sympathetic but not particularly concerned. Missing persons cases involving undocumented immigrants rarely got priority attention. He'd promised to look into it, but Margaret could see in his eyes that it would go nowhere. So Margaret had started investigating on her own. She'd talked to Elena's co-workers, her children's teachers, the owner of the bodega where Elena bought groceries. Piece by piece, a story emerged, a story about a man named Victor Reyes, who ran what appeared to be a legitimate staffing agency but was actually trafficking undocumented workers, using threats of deportation to keep them silent while he pocketed most of their wages and forced them into increasingly dangerous situations. Elena had tried to leave. She'd tried to report him. And then she'd disappeared. Margaret had taken everything she'd learned back to James. This time, he'd listened. Together, they'd built a case, conducting their own investigation while James tried to work through official channels. But Victor Reyes had connections, powerful connections that reached into city government, into the police department itself. And then, late one October night, Margaret had received a call from a blocked number. A woman's voice, barely a whisper, speaking rapid Spanish that Margaret's rusty high school language skills could barely follow. But she caught enough. Warehouse, Riverside District, Building 7, tonight, help. Elena. Margaret had called James immediately. He'd told her to stay home, that he'd handle it, but Margaret had seen too many cases fall through the cracks, too many promises of help that never materialized. So she'd driven to the warehouse district herself, arriving just as the sun was setting. The area had been abandoned for years, a maze of decaying buildings and rusted chain-link fences. Margaret had parked a block away and approached on foot, her heart hammering, second-guessing every step. Building 7. The door had been slightly ajar. Inside, the warehouse was dark except for a single light in a back office. Margaret had heard voices, men speaking in harsh tones, and a woman crying. Elena. She'd pulled out her phone to call James again when she heard the gunshot. Everything after that had happened so fast it still felt like a blur, even now, 10 years later. Margaret had run toward the office, had seen Elena on the floor bleeding from her shoulder, had seen Victor Reyes standing over her with a gun, 2 other men flanking him. Margaret had screamed. Victor had turned. His gun had swung toward her. And then James had burst through the door behind her, his own weapon drawn, shouting police commands. What happened next was chaos, shouting, movement, another gunshot. When the dust settled, Victor Reyes lay dead on the concrete floor, shot by James in what would be ruled a clean self-defense killing. But that wasn't the whole truth. Because in those frantic seconds, in the darkness and confusion, Margaret had seen something. Something she'd never told anyone, something that had haunted every moment of the last 10 years. She'd seen James's face as he pulled the trigger. And it hadn't been fear she saw there, or duty, or even anger. It had been satisfaction. Revenge. Cold, calculated execution. Victor Reyes hadn't been reaching for a weapon. His gun had already been on the ground. He'd been surrendering. And James had shot him anyway. Margaret opened her eyes, her heart racing as if she'd been running. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday, every detail burned into her consciousness. Elena had survived. She'd been rushed to the hospital, treated for her gunshot wound, and once recovered, she'd taken her children and disappeared, possibly back to Guatemala, possibly to another city, definitely to somewhere she could feel safe. Margaret had never heard from her again. James had been investigated by Internal Affairs, but Margaret had backed his story. She'd testified that Victor had been reaching for his weapon, that James had no choice, that it was a clean shooting. She'd lied under oath to protect a man who'd committed murder. She'd told herself it was justified. That Victor Reyes was a monster who trafficked and exploited vulnerable people, who'd shot Elena and would have killed them both if given the chance. That the world was better off without him. But lying to herself didn't stop the nightmares. Didn't stop the guilt that gnawed at her conscience like a cancer. Didn't stop her from feeling like a murderer herself for covering up the truth. James had made her promise never to speak of it. The other two men in the warehouse that night had fled and were never caught. It was just Margaret and James who knew what really happened in those crucial seconds. And now, 10 years later, the warehouse where it all took place was about to be demolished. Margaret pulled herself out of bed as dawn light began creeping through her curtains. She moved through her morning routine mechanically, shower, dress, coffee, her mind already at the coffee shop on Morrison Street, already preparing for the conversation she'd been avoiding for a decade. She left the house before Catherine could stop by for her usual morning check-in. The drive downtown felt surreal, as if she were watching herself from outside her body. The city had changed so much in 10 years, new buildings rising where old ones once stood, neighborhoods transforming from industrial to residential. But the coffee shop on Morrison Street looked exactly the same, a small, independent place with mismatched furniture and walls covered in local art. Margaret had been here countless times over the years, a neutral space where her past and present never quite collided. Until today. James was already there, sitting in a back corner booth with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept any better than Margaret had. When he saw her enter, something like relief crossed his face. Margaret slid into the booth across from him, accepting the coffee he pushed toward her. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 10 years pressing down on them both. "I thought you'd moved away," Margaret said finally. After everything." "I did," James replied. "Took a job in Seattle, tried to start over. But I came back 6 months ago. My daughter had a baby, my first grandchild. I couldn't stay away. Congratulations." "Thank you." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, staring into the dark liquid. "I never wanted to involve you in this again, Margaret. I really didn't. But when I saw that article about the demolition..." "What's buried there, James?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "What are they going to find?" James was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession. "Do you remember the 2 men who were in the warehouse that night? Victor's associates?" "Of course. They got away. You never found them." "That's not exactly true." James looked up, meeting her eyes. "I found one of them. 3 days after the shooting. His name was Miguel Santos, and he was planning to go to the press with his version of what happened that night. His version where I executed Victor in cold blood." Margaret's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "What did you do?" "I met with him. Tried to reason with him. Offered him money to disappear, to stay quiet." James's hands were shaking now. "He refused. Said he owed it to Victor's family to tell the truth. Said he couldn't live with himself otherwise." "James." "We struggled. I didn't plan it, Margaret, I swear I didn't. But he fell, hit his head on a concrete pillar. And he just stopped breathing." James's voice broke. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do. So I buried him. In the basement of Warehouse 7. The same warehouse where Victor died." The coffee shop seemed to tilt around Margaret. She gripped the edge of the table, her vision swimming. "You killed someone else. And you never told me." "I couldn't. Don't you see? You were already protecting me for Victor. I couldn't drag you deeper into this. So I dealt with it alone. Filed Miguel Santos as a missing person, let the investigation go cold. I thought it would stay buried forever. But now they're demolishing the warehouse. Now they're demolishing the warehouse, James echoed. And when they do, they're going to find Miguel's remains. They're going to run DNA tests, identify him, investigate how he died. And everything, Victor, the shooting, what really happened, it's all going to come out. Margaret sat back, her mind reeling. She'd carried the weight of one covered-up killing for 10 years. Now she was being asked to shoulder two. Why are you telling me this now, she asked. Because I need your help. One more time. James leaned forward, his voice urgent. Miguel's death was an accident, but no one will believe that. Not when they connect it to Victor's case. They'll reinvestigate everything, interview everyone again, including you. And if you change your story now, if you tell the truth about what you saw that night, you'll go to prison for murder. I'll go to prison for 2 murders. And you'll be charged as an accessory for lying to investigators. James reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. Margaret, I'm not asking you to lie again. I'm just asking you to help me figure out what to do before it's too late. Margaret pulled her hand away. What could we possibly do? The warehouse is coming down in 2 weeks. We could go to the police now. Together. Come clean about everything, throw ourselves on the mercy of the court. Plead that Victor's killing was justified even if the shooting wasn't technically clean, that Miguel's death was an accident. Maybe, with full disclosure and after all this time, we'd still go to prison, James. You for murder and obstruction of justice. Me for perjury and being an accessory. Margaret shook her head. I'm 85 years old. I have a daughter, a granddaughter. They think I'm just a sweet old librarian. This would destroy them. I know. God, Margaret, I know. James dropped his head into his hands. I've been living with this for 10 years. Every day wondering if this would be the day it all came crashing down. And now it's finally happening, and I don't know what to do. Margaret looked at this man who'd once been a decorated detective, now reduced to a tortured soul seeking redemption he'd never be able to find. She thought about Elena, wherever she was, hopefully living in peace. She thought about Victor Reyes, a predator who'd exploited countless vulnerable people. She thought about Miguel Santos, a man who died trying to do the right thing. And she thought about herself, an 85-year-old woman who'd spent 10 years living a lie, who'd looked her family in the eye every day knowing she was a fraud, who'd allowed fear to silence her conscience. I need to think, Margaret said, standing up on shaky legs. I can't make this decision right now. We don't have much time. I know. Give me a day. Just one day. James nodded, looking defeated. Okay. One day. But Margaret? Whatever we decide, we need to do it together. I dragged you into this. I won't let you go down alone. Margaret left the coffee shop without responding, stepping out into the cool October morning. The city bustled around her, people rushing to work, living their normal lives, unburdened by the weight of decade-old secrets. She drove aimlessly for an hour, her mind spinning through scenarios, each one ending in disaster. Finally, she found herself at the old library where she'd worked for 40 years. It had been renovated since her retirement, modernized, but the bones of it were still the same. Margaret sat in her car in the parking lot, staring at the building where she'd spent the best years of her life. She'd always thought of herself as a good person, someone who helped others, who lived honestly, who did the right thing. But what was the right thing now? Her phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Mom, where are you? I stopped by the house and you weren't there. Starting to worry. Margaret stared at the message, this small reminder of the life she'd built, the people who loved her, the peace she'd cultivated. A peace built on lies. She typed a response, just out running errands. See you for dinner. Another lie. But what was one more? For the next 3 days, Margaret moved through her life like a ghost haunting her own existence. She had dinner with Catherine and her family, played board games with Sophie, attended her weekly book club meeting, and smiled through every moment while her mind churned endlessly with the impossible choice before her. James texted her every day, asking if she'd made a decision. She responded with requests for more time, knowing that time was the one thing they didn't have. On the 4th day, Margaret drove to the Riverside warehouse district. She hadn't been back since that night 10 years ago, had actively avoided it even when traffic or errands might have taken her nearby. But now she needed to see it, needed to confront the physical space where her life had fractured into before and after. The area was even more desolate than she remembered. Most of the warehouses had been tagged with graffiti, their windows broken, their doors hanging off hinges. Chain-link fences surrounded the property, posted with signs warning against trespassing. But Margaret could see that preparations for demolition had already begun. Survey markers dotted the ground. A construction trailer sat at the far end of the lot. A large sign announced the future site of Riverside Luxury Residences, coming spring 2027. Building 7 stood in the middle of the complex, a hulking structure of brick and corroded metal. Somewhere inside, in the basement, lay the remains of Miguel Santos, waiting to tell a story that would unravel everything. I thought I might find you here. Margaret spun around to find Catherine standing behind her, arms crossed, her lawyer expression firmly in place. What are you doing here? Margaret asked, her heart hammering. Following you. You've been acting strange since your birthday, Mom. Secretive. Distracted. And then that man who showed up at the house, I ran his name. James Harrison. Former detective, took early retirement 10 years ago under circumstances that were never fully explained. Catherine's eyes were sharp, prosecutorial. So I'm going to ask you one more time, what's really going on? Margaret's mouth went dry. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading. Her daughter, trained to uncover truth, standing before her demanding answers. It's complicated, Catherine. Then uncomplicate it for me. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're involved in something that's making you terrified. And as your daughter and your lawyer, I need to know what that is. As my lawyer? The distinction caught Margaret off guard. If you need legal representation, Mom, I'm offering it. Attorney-client privilege means anything you tell me stays between us. Catherine's expression softened slightly. But as your daughter, I'm just worried. Please. Talk to me. Margaret looked at her daughter, this fierce, intelligent woman she'd raised, who'd built a career on pursuing justice and truth. How could she possibly explain that her mild-mannered librarian mother had spent 10 years covering up a killing? But maybe that was exactly why she needed to explain it. Get in my car, Margaret said quietly. There's something I need to show you. They drove in silence to a storage unit facility on the edge of town. Margaret had rented the small unit 15 years ago, originally to store Thomas's belongings after he died, unable to bear sorting through them. But over time, it had become something else, a repository for the parts of her life she couldn't reconcile with the person she pretended to be. Catherine followed her mother through the maze of identical orange doors until they reached Unit 247. Margaret's hands shook as she fumbled with the padlock, but she finally got it open and pulled up the rolling door. Inside, boxes were stacked neatly, labeled with black marker, Thomas's books, winter clothes, kitchen items. But Margaret moved past all of these to a small fireproof safe in the back corner. She knelt down, her knees protesting, and entered the combination. Inside the safe was a single manila folder. Margaret pulled it out and stood, holding it against her chest for a long moment before finally turning and handing it to Catherine. What is this? Catherine asked. The truth, Margaret said. Everything I've been hiding for 10 years. Catherine opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings about Victor Reyes's death, police reports that Margaret had somehow obtained, photographs of the warehouse, a journal where Margaret had written down everything she remembered about that night, including what she'd really seen when James pulled the trigger. Margaret watched her daughter's face as she read, saw shock give way to confusion, then to horror, then to something harder to define, a lawyer processing information, weighing evidence, calculating consequences. "My God," Catherine whispered when she finally looked up. "Mom, you witnessed a murder." "I witnessed a complicated situation." With no good answers, Margaret corrected. Victor Reyes was a monster who'd shot Elena, who'd exploited and trafficked vulnerable people for years. James stopped him. "Yes, it might have been excessive force, but you lied to investigators. You committed perjury." Catherine's voice was sharp now, clinical. "Do you understand what that means? The statute of limitations hasn't expired. You could still be prosecuted." "I know. And it gets worse." Margaret took a deep breath. "There's another body. A man named Miguel Santos. James told me he buried him in the warehouse basement after an accident. When they demolish that building, they'll find evidence of another death connected to the same case." Catherine sat down heavily on a box of Thomas's books, the folder still clutched in her hands. "Jesus, Mom. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you carry this alone?" "Because I was ashamed. Because I didn't want you to know that your mother was capable of this." Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes for the first time in years. "You've always looked at me like I'm this good, simple person. Your sweet mother who worked at the library and baked cookies and lived an honest life. How could I tell you I'd helped cover up a killing? Because I'm your daughter." Catherine stood up, her own eyes wet now. "Because families tell each other the truth, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." They stood facing each other in the small storage unit, surrounded by the boxed-up remnants of ordinary life, while the evidence of extraordinary choices sat between them. "What do I do?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. "Catherine, please. Tell me what to do." Catherine wiped her eyes and transformed before Margaret's eyes from daughter to attorney. "As your lawyer, I need to know everything. Every detail, every conversation, every piece of evidence. Then we need to assess our options. And as my daughter?" Catherine pulled her mother into a fierce hug. "As your daughter, I'm telling you that I love you and we're going to figure this out together. No more secrets. No more carrying this alone. Okay?" Margaret clung to her daughter, feeling something inside her chest crack open, a decade of isolation and fear finally finding release. "Okay," she whispered. "No more secrets." They spent the next 3 hours in that storage unit, Catherine asking questions while Margaret answered, laying out the full scope of what had happened 10 years ago. Catherine took notes on her phone, her legal mind already working through strategies and possibilities. "We need to talk to James Harrison," Catherine said finally. "Get his full account, assess whether his story about Miguel Santos holds up. If it really was an accident." He said they struggled. "That Miguel fell. That could be manslaughter rather than murder. Especially if Miguel was threatening him, if there were mitigating circumstances." Catherine was pacing now, thinking aloud. "The question is whether we go to the authorities proactively or wait to see if the body is discovered." Going proactively would show good faith, Margaret offered. It would also guarantee prosecution. Whereas if the demolition happens and somehow Miguel's remains aren't found, or if they are but can't be connected to James, then we get away with it. Again. Catherine stopped pacing and looked at her mother. "I'm not saying that's what we should do. I'm just laying out all the options. As your lawyer, I have to consider every angle. And as my daughter? What do you think I should do?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "I think you need to decide what kind of person you want to be for whatever time you have left. And I think you already know the answer, or you wouldn't have kept that folder all these years. Margaret looked down at the manila folder, at her own handwriting documenting truth she'd been too afraid to speak. Catherine was right. She'd known all along what she needed to do. She'd just been waiting for the courage to do it. "I need to talk to James," Margaret said. "One more time. And then I think we need to tell the truth." Catherine nodded. "I'll set up a meeting. Somewhere private where we can all talk. And Mom, whatever happens, whatever consequences come from this, we'll face them together." That evening, Catherine arranged for them to meet James at her law office after hours. Margaret sat in the conference room, feeling small in the leather chair, while Catherine laid out legal pads and pens with the precision of someone preparing for battle. James arrived looking haggard, his eyes widening when he saw Catherine. "What's she doing here?" "She's my lawyer," Margaret said. "And my daughter. She knows everything." "Margaret, you can't just." "I can and I did." Margaret's voice was firmer than she expected. "No more secrets, James. No more lies. We're going to figure out the right thing to do, and we're going to do it together." James sank into a chair, looking older than his years. "The right thing is going to put us both in prison." "Maybe," Catherine interjected. "Or maybe not. But first, I need to hear your full account of what happened with Miguel Santos. Every detail, and I need you to be completely honest. As an attorney, I can't represent you, but I can advise my mother on how your testimony might affect her case." For the next hour, James told his story. How he tracked Miguel Santos through informants, how he'd arranged a meeting, how he tried to pay Miguel to disappear. How Miguel had refused, had threatened to expose everything, had become increasingly agitated. "I reached for my phone to call for backup," James said, his voice hollow. "Miguel thought I was reaching for a weapon. He lunged at me, we struggled. He was bigger than me, stronger. We fell, and his head hit the concrete pillar. I heard the crack, and then, nothing. He just stopped moving." "Did you call for medical assistance?" Catherine asked. "I checked for a pulse. There wasn't one. He was already gone." James covered his face with his hands. "I panicked. If I reported it, the whole Victor Reyes case would be reopened. Margaret would be implicated. My career would be over. So I made a choice. I buried him in the warehouse basement, covered it with old concrete and debris. And I've been living with that choice every day since." "Were there any witnesses? Any cameras in the area?" "No. The warehouse was completely abandoned. That's why I chose it for the meeting." Catherine made notes, her expression neutral. "And you're certain Miguel's remains are in Warehouse 7? The same one scheduled for demolition?" "Yes. Unless someone else found them in the past 10 years, which I doubt. Nobody goes down in those basements." Catherine set down her pen and looked between her mother and James. "Here's what I think we're dealing with, Margaret. You're facing potential perjury charges for your testimony in the Victor Reyes investigation. The statute of limitations on perjury in this state is 7 years, which means technically you're past that. However, if this is considered an ongoing cover-up, that could reset the clock." "And me?" James asked. "You're looking at potential manslaughter charges for Miguel Santos, if we can successfully argue it was unintentional. The burial and cover-up would be obstruction of justice, concealing a death, tampering with evidence. And if they reopen the Victor Reyes case and determine the shooting wasn't justified, you could face murder charges there as well." "So we're screwed either way," James said flatly. "Not necessarily." Catherine leaned forward. "If you both come forward voluntarily, express remorse, cooperate fully, that counts for something. Judges and juries are more sympathetic to defendants who show genuine contrition. And Margaret, your age and clean record would work in your favor." "What about prison time?" Margaret asked quietly. "I won't lie to you, Mom. It's possible. Especially for James. But it's also possible you'd receive probation, house arrest, or a suspended sentence, particularly given the circumstances and the time that's passed." Catherine's voice softened. The question isn't whether there will be consequences. There will be. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't come forward. The room fell silent. Margaret could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic outside, the ticking of the clock on the wall marking the seconds of their shared indecision. "I can't live like this anymore," Margaret said finally. "I've spent 10 years looking over my shoulder, jumping every time the phone rings, lying to everyone I love. Even if telling the truth means prison, at least I'd finally be free." James looked at her with something like awe. "You're really going to do it? After all this time, you're actually going to tell the truth?" "We're going to tell the truth," Margaret corrected. "Together. Like you said, you won't let me go down alone, and I won't let you either. We're in this together, James. We have been since that night." "What if," James's voice broke. "What if I don't have your courage? Then I'll have enough for both of us." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand, a gesture of solidarity between two people bound by shared guilt and shared responsibility. "We can do this. We have to." Catherine watched the exchange with careful eyes. "If you're both certain this is what you want to do, I can help you prepare. We'll need to contact the district attorney's office, arrange for a voluntary surrender, negotiate the terms of your cooperation. It won't be easy, but I'll be with you every step of the way." "How long do we have?" James asked. "The demolition is scheduled to begin in 10 days. We should come forward before then. It'll look better if we're proactive rather than reactive." Catherine pulled out her phone, checking her calendar. "I can reach out to the DA's office tomorrow, set up a meeting for later this week. That gives us time to prepare your statements, gather documentation, build the best possible case for leniency." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, not quite relief, but a loosening of the vice that had gripped her heart for so long. The decision was made. The path forward was clear, even if it led somewhere terrifying. "There's something else," Margaret said. "Elena. She needs to know what we're doing, what's going to happen. She deserves to know the truth. Do you know how to reach her?" Catherine asked. "No. She disappeared after the shooting. But maybe James could find her. One last investigation before everything comes out." James nodded slowly. "I can try. I kept tabs on her for a while after she left, just to make sure she was safe. Last I heard, she was in Phoenix, working as a nurse's aide. I might be able to track her down." "Do it," Margaret said. "She was the victim in all of this. She deserves to know that we're finally going to tell her story, that Victor's evil is going to be fully exposed, that she didn't suffer for nothing." 3 days later, Margaret received a phone call that changed everything. She was in her kitchen making tea when her phone rang, an unknown number with a Phoenix area code. Her first thought was that James had found Elena. Her second thought was to wonder why Elena would be calling her directly. "Hello? Margaret? Margaret Winters?" The voice was familiar but different, older, worn by years of hard living, but still unmistakably the woman who'd sat across from her twice a week learning to read. "Elena?" Margaret's hand shook, nearly dropping the phone. "Is it really you?" "Yes. Detective Harrison found me. He told me everything. About what you saw that night. About what he did." There was a long pause, filled with the static of distance. "I needed to call you. I needed to hear your voice." Margaret sank into a kitchen chair, tears already forming. "Elena, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't tell the truth from the beginning. You deserved better than my silence. Detective Harrison told me you're coming forward now. That you're going to expose everything, even though it might mean prison for both of you." Elena's voice cracked. "Margaret, why? Why would you do that after all this time?" "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I can't live with the lie anymore. Because you and all the people Victor hurt deserve the truth. But you could go to prison. You're 85 years old. I know. But Elena, I've been in a prison of my own making for 10 years. At least this way, I'll finally be free. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Elena spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. I need to tell you something. Something I've never told anyone, not even my children. About that night in the warehouse. Margaret's pulse quickened. What about it? When Victor shot me, when I was lying on that floor bleeding, I heard everything. I saw everything. Elena took a shaky breath. I saw Detective Harrison come in. I saw Victor drop his gun. I saw him raise his hands to surrender. And I saw Harrison shoot him anyway. Margaret's world tilted. You saw. All this time, you knew. Yes. And I've carried that knowledge for 10 years, just like you. Because part of me was glad Victor was dead. Part of me thought he deserved exactly what he got. But another part of me knew it was wrong, knew that no matter what Victor did, murder is murder. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you come forward? Because I was terrified. Because I was undocumented, because I had 3 children who depended on me, because I knew that speaking up would destroy my life and probably wouldn't bring Victor back anyway. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. I was a coward, Margaret. Just like you. Just like Harrison. We all chose silence because it was easier than facing the truth. Margaret felt something crack open inside her, a realization so profound it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. Then you could corroborate my account. You could testify to what really happened. I could. And I will, if you need me to. I'm ready to tell the truth too. Elena, no. You've already lost so much. Your home, your friends, the life you built here. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Elena's voice grew stronger. Detective Harrison told me something else. He told me about Miguel Santos. About the other body in that warehouse. Margaret froze. He told you about Miguel? He told me everything. And Margaret, I need to tell you something about Miguel. Something that changes everything you think you know about that night. What do you mean? Miguel Santos wasn't Victor's associate. He was mine. The words didn't make sense at first. Margaret's brain struggled to process them, to fit them into the narrative she'd constructed over the past decade. I don't understand, Margaret said. Miguel was my cousin. He came to the United States 5 years before me, established himself, got legal status through marriage. When I started working for Victor, when I realized what he was really doing, I went to Miguel for help. He's the one who convinced me to try to report Victor to the police. He's the one who was gathering evidence against Victor's operation. Margaret's hand gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. James said Miguel was one of Victor's men. James lied. Or maybe he really didn't know. Miguel was trying to expose Victor from the inside, pretending to be one of his associates while actually documenting everything, the trafficking, the exploitation, the threats. He had notebooks full of evidence, photographs, recorded conversations. When Victor shot me, Miguel was the one who called you from my phone. He was trying to save me. But then why would Miguel threaten to expose James to the press? Why would he have details about what really happened? Because he was there, Margaret. In the warehouse that night. Hiding. Watching. He saw everything, saw Victor shoot me, saw you arrive, saw Harrison kill Victor. And afterward, Miguel tried to use that information to make Harrison help him bring down the rest of Victor's network. Margaret felt like she was free-falling through darkness. So when James said they struggled, when he said Miguel died by accident. I don't know if it was an accident or not. I only know that Miguel went to meet Harrison 3 days after the shooting, and Miguel never came home. Elena's voice broke. For 10 years, I've wondered what happened to him. I've blamed myself, thinking maybe if I hadn't involved him, if I hadn't asked for his help, he'd still be alive. And now I know. Now I finally know that he's been buried in that warehouse basement all this time, 20 feet from where Victor died. Margaret's mind was reeling. Miguel Santos wasn't a criminal trying to protect Victor's reputation. He was a hero trying to expose a trafficking ring. Which meant James's entire story about their confrontation might be a lie. Which meant, "I need to talk to James," Margaret said urgently. "I need to hear his explanation for this." "Be careful, Margaret. If Harrison lied about who Miguel was, he might have lied about how Miguel died too." Elena paused. "My cousin was a good man. He was trying to do the right thing. If Harrison killed him to keep him quiet, then we're not just dealing with one questionable shooting and one tragic accident. We're dealing with cold-blooded murder." Margaret called James immediately after hanging up with Elena, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. He answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. "Margaret? What's wrong? We need to meet. Now." "Catherine's office, 1 hour." "What's happened?" "I spoke with Elena Rodriguez. She told me about Miguel Santos. She told me who he really was." Margaret's voice was ice. "And James? You better have a damn good explanation for why you lied to me." She hung up before he could respond. Catherine arrived at her office at the same time as Margaret, immediately sensing something was wrong. "Mom. What's going on?" Margaret filled her in on Elena's revelations as they waited for James. Catherine's expression grew darker with each detail, her legal mind already calculating the implications. If Miguel Santos was actually working against Victor's operation, if he was gathering evidence as a whistleblower, then James's claim of self-defense becomes much harder to justify, Catherine said. And if Harrison deliberately misrepresented who Miguel was, then everything he's told us might be a lie, Margaret finished. James arrived 15 minutes later, looking wary. He took one look at their faces and stopped in the doorway. "You talked to Elena?" "I talked to Elena," Margaret confirmed. "She told me about Miguel. About who he really was. About why you really killed him." "Margaret, let me explain. Was anything you told us true?" Margaret's voice shook with anger and betrayal. "Or have you been manipulating me for 10 years? James sank into a chair, his face ashen. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "Miguel Santos was a threat," he said finally. "Not because he was one of Victor's men, I knew he wasn't. But because he had evidence. Real evidence that would have proven Victor's operation went deeper than anyone suspected, that it involved people with power, people with connections. People who would have done anything to keep that information buried. So you killed him to protect them?" Catherine's voice was sharp with disgust. "I killed him to protect myself." James's composure cracked, his voice rising. "You have to understand, after I shot Victor, I thought it was over. But then Miguel approached me with his notebooks, his recordings, and he told me he had proof that Victor's operation had been protected by cops on the payroll. Cops including me." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "You were working for Victor?" "Not directly. Not knowingly. But I'd been taking money to look the other way, to lose evidence, to delay investigations. I didn't know the full scope of what Victor was doing, I thought it was just workers getting paid under the table, tax evasion, nothing violent. But when Miguel showed me his evidence, when I saw what my willful blindness had enabled." James's voice broke. "I panicked. If that information came out, I'd lose everything. My career, my pension, my family. I'd go to prison." "So you killed him," Margaret said flatly. "You killed a good man who was trying to expose corruption and trafficking, and then you buried him like garbage." "I didn't plan it. I swear I didn't plan it. I just wanted to talk to him, to convince him to give me the evidence, to let me be the one to bring down the rest of Victor's network. But he refused. He said he couldn't trust any cop, especially not one who'd already killed a man. We argued, and yes, we struggled, and when he fell." James looked up, his eyes wet. "I could have called for help. I could have tried to save him. But I didn't. I let him die, and then I buried him and I buried his evidence with him." The room fell into stunned silence. Margaret felt like she was seeing James Harrison for the first time, Not the complicated detective who'd made one terrible choice in the heat of the moment, but a corrupt cop who'd been willing to kill to protect his secrets. All this time, Margaret whispered, "I've been protecting you. Lying for you. Carrying the weight of what I thought was a justified shooting of a dangerous criminal. And it was all a lie. The shooting of Victor was justified," James insisted. "He'd shot Elena, he was armed. He'd dropped his weapon. He was surrendering." Margaret stood up, her 85-year-old body trembling with rage. "And I saw it. I saw it and I lied about it because I thought you were a hero stopping a monster. But you're a monster too, aren't you? Just a different kind." "Mom," Catherine said gently, putting a hand on Margaret's arm. "Let's all take a breath. No. No more breathing, no more thinking, no more waiting." Margaret turned to her daughter. "I want to go to the police. Tonight. Right now. I want to tell them everything, what I saw the night Victor died, what James just admitted about Miguel, all of it." "Margaret, please," James stood, reaching toward her. "If you do this, we both go down. You committed perjury. You'll face charges too. I don't care anymore. I'd rather face those charges knowing I finally told the truth than spend one more second protecting a murderer." James's expression hardened. "You think the truth matters? You think telling your story is going to bring Miguel back or punish the real villains?" He laughed, a bitter sound. "The people Miguel had evidence on, they're still out there. Still in power. Still protected. Without his notebooks, without his recordings, there's no proof of the wider conspiracy. And I made sure that evidence stayed buried with him." "Then we dig it up," Catherine said suddenly. "Before the demolition. We go to that warehouse, we excavate the basement, we find Miguel's remains and his evidence. Then we have everything we need to expose not just what happened to Victor and Miguel, but the entire network they were fighting against." Margaret looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and horror. "Catherine, that's illegal. We'd be tampering with a crime scene. The crime scene is about to be demolished anyway. Once those bulldozers start, any evidence will be destroyed forever." Catherine turned to James. "You know exactly where Miguel is buried. You could take us there." "Why would I do that?" James asked. "You're talking about evidence that would guarantee my conviction for murder." "Because deep down, you know it's the right thing to do," Margaret said quietly. "Because even though you've made terrible choices, even though you've lied and killed and covered it up, I don't believe you're completely beyond redemption. Miguel Santos died trying to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. Don't let his death be meaningless. Help us finish what he started." James looked between them, calculation and something else, perhaps conscience, warring on his face. "If I do this, if I help you recover the evidence, I'm signing my own prison sentence." "Yes," Catherine said simply. "But you'd also be doing the right thing for the first time in 10 years. And who knows? Cooperation, remorse, helping to bring down a trafficking network, that might count for something in sentencing. Or it might not." "Or it might not," Catherine agreed. "But at least you'd know you tried to make amends. At least you'd know you stopped being part of the problem and became part of the solution." Margaret watched James struggle with the decision, saw the decades of compromise and moral flexibility fighting against whatever kernel of integrity might still exist within him. "The demolition starts in 7 days, James said finally. "If we're going to do this, it has to be soon. Tonight or tomorrow at the latest." "Tonight," Margaret said firmly. "Before any of us lose our nerve." At midnight, 3 unlikely conspirators stood outside the chain-link fence surrounding the Riverside warehouse district. Margaret, 85 years old and dressed in dark clothes that made her feel ridiculous. Catherine, who'd brought a backpack full of supplies that included a camera, evidence bags, and her legal credentials in case they were caught. And James, carrying a shovel and a flashlight, looking like a man approaching his own execution. "This is insane," Catherine muttered as she cut through the fence with bolt cutters she'd borrowed from a contractor friend. "I'm an officer of the court. If we get caught, I could be disbarred. Then we won't get caught, Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. They slipped through the gap in the fence and made their way across the cracked pavement toward Warehouse 7. The building loomed above them, dark and foreboding, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring down at their transgression. James led them to a side door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the warehouse was even more desolate than Margaret remembered, empty except for debris and the ghosts of whatever industry had once thrived here. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating graffiti-covered walls and puddles of stagnant water. The basement entrance is this way, James said, his voice echoing in the vast space. They descended a metal staircase that creaked ominously under their weight. The basement was pitch black, their flashlights barely penetrating the gloom. The air smelled of mold and decay and something else, something older and darker. There, James said, pointing to a far corner where the concrete floor looked newer than the surrounding area. That's where I buried him. Margaret stood at the edge of the space, looking down at what amounted to Miguel Santos's unmarked grave. For 10 years, he'd lain here in the dark, his truth buried with him, while the people he tried to protect went on suffering. I'm sorry, Miguel, she whispered. I'm so sorry we failed you. James began to dig, breaking through the newer concrete with a sledgehammer they'd brought. The sound echoed through the basement like thunder, and Margaret kept expecting security guards or police to come running. But no one came. They were alone with their secrets and their attempt at redemption. It took 2 hours of digging before James's shovel hit something that wasn't concrete or dirt. Something wrapped in plastic, preserved against decay. I've got something, James said, his voice tight. Catherine moved forward with the camera, documenting everything. Margaret held her flashlight steady as James carefully uncovered a large plastic-wrapped bundle. Inside was a body, or what remained of one after 10 years, bones and dried tissue, still wearing the clothes Miguel Santos had died in. And clutched against the skeleton's chest was a weatherproof case. James opened the case with shaking hands. Inside were notebooks, USB drives, and a digital recorder, all sealed in plastic bags to protect against moisture. Catherine began carefully removing items, photographing each one, documenting chain of custody even though this entire excavation was illegal. Her legal training wouldn't let her do this any other way, even in the middle of a criminal act. There's so much here, Catherine said, paging through one of the notebooks. Names, dates, locations, bank account numbers. Miguel documented everything. Including my involvement, James said quietly, pointing to a page that detailed payments he'd received, investigations he deliberately botched, evidence he'd made disappear. Margaret looked at the man who dragged her into this decade-long conspiracy and felt something unexpected, pity. James Harrison had started down a path of small compromises that had led to bigger betrayals, until finally he'd become the very thing he'd sworn to fight against. What do we do now? Margaret asked. Now we call the police, Catherine said, pulling out her phone. We tell them we received an anonymous tip about this location, that we came to investigate and found remains and evidence. We turn over everything we've found, and then we cooperate fully with whatever investigation follows. They'll know we're lying, James said. They'll know we broke in here. Probably. But what are they going to do? Arrest 3 people who just handed them evidence of a major trafficking network and solved a 10-year-old missing persons case? Catherine shook her head. We might face consequences for trespassing and tampering with a crime scene. But we'll also be heroes who exposed corruption and brought justice for Miguel Santos. And for Elena, Margaret added. And for all the people Victor exploited. And for everyone else still trapped in situations like the one that started all of this. James looked at Miguel's remains, at the evidence that would destroy his life, and nodded slowly. Make the call. If you were in Margaret's position, would you have the courage to come forward after 10 years? Or would fear of the consequences keep you silent? Let me know in the comments, I'm genuinely curious about what you'd do. The police arrived within 20 minutes, followed shortly by crime scene investigators, detectives, and eventually the district attorney herself. The warehouse basement became a hive of activity, bright lights replacing the darkness, professional voices replacing their whispered confessions. Margaret, Catherine, and James were separated immediately for questioning. Margaret found herself in the back of a police cruiser, a young officer reading her rights while another called for a detective to conduct a formal interview. "I understand my rights," Margaret said when the officer finished. "And I'm waiving them. I want to tell you everything." The officer looked uncertain. 85-year-old women didn't usually waive their rights to counsel, but he pulled out a recording device and began the official interview. Margaret told the truth. All of it. Everything she'd witnessed 10 years ago, everything she'd lied about in her original statement, everything she'd learned in the past week. She held nothing back, letting the words flow like a confession that had been dammed up for too long. When she finished, the officer sat back, his expression stunned. "Ma'am, you understand that you've just admitted to perjury, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence?" "I understand. And I'm prepared to face the consequences." "But officer, that evidence you're recovering from the basement, it's going to expose a trafficking network that's been operating for years. Miguel Santos died trying to bring those people to justice. Make sure his death counts for something." The officer nodded slowly. "We will, ma'am. I promise you, we will." By dawn, the warehouse was still crawling with investigators. Margaret was allowed to leave the police car but instructed not to leave the scene. She found Catherine sitting on the hood of her car, looking exhausted. "How'd your interview go?" Margaret asked. "About as well as can be expected when you admit to breaking and entering, tampering with a crime scene, and aiding in an illegal excavation." Catherine managed a weak smile. "But they seem more interested in the evidence we found than in prosecuting us. At least for now." "And James?" "They arrested him. Murder, obstruction of justice, corruption. He's being transported to the county jail as we speak." Catherine's expression was complicated. "He gave a full confession. Told them everything, including names of other cops who were on Victor's payroll. He's cooperating fully." Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that the truth was finally out, sadness for the man James could have been, anger at the man he'd actually become. "Mom," Catherine said gently, "you should prepare yourself. The DA told me they're going to charge you with perjury and obstruction. You'll have to appear in court, possibly stand trial." "I know. I'm ready. Are you?" "Really?" Catherine took her mother's hand. "You could go to prison, Mom. At your age, even a short sentence could." She didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. At 85, even a year in prison could be a death sentence. "I'd rather die in prison having told the truth than live free with this lie," Margaret said. "I'm tired, Catherine. So tired of carrying this weight. Whatever happens next, at least I'll finally be able to sleep at night." They sat in silence as the sun rose over the warehouse district, painting the industrial landscape in shades of gold and pink. It would have been beautiful if not for the crime scene tape and police vehicles surrounding them. Margaret's phone rang. "Elena." "I saw the news," Elena said without preamble. "They're reporting that a body was found in a warehouse, that there's evidence of a trafficking network." "Margaret, did you?" "We found Miguel," Margaret said. "We found him and his evidence. The police have it all now. Your cousin's going to get justice, Elena. Finally." Elena sobbed on the other end of the line, a sound of grief and relief tangled together. "Thank you. Thank you for not letting him disappear forever." "There's something else," Margaret said. "The evidence Miguel collected, it's comprehensive. The police are already making arrests based on what they've found. The entire network is coming down. Your cousin didn't die for nothing. He would be glad to know that. So glad." Elena paused. "And you? What will happen to you?" "I don't know yet. But Elena, whatever happens, I want you to know, you were right to trust me all those years ago. You deserved better than what I gave you then, but I'm trying to make it right now. You already have. You've given me closure and justice and the truth. That's more than I ever expected." Elena's voice grew stronger. "If they let me, I want to testify. I want to tell the court what I saw, what I know. I want to help you however I can. Are you sure? You'd be exposing yourself, risking your safety. I'm sure. I've been hiding for 10 years, just like you. Maybe it's time we both stop hiding. The next 3 days were a blur of legal proceedings and media frenzy. Miguel Santos's remains were formally identified. The evidence he'd collected led to indictments of 17 people, including 5 police officers, 2 city officials, and a network of business owners who'd been complicit in the trafficking operation. James Harrison was charged with murder, obstruction of justice, corruption, and a dozen other counts. His attorney was negotiating a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against the other corrupt officials. And Margaret was charged with perjury and obstruction of justice, with a court date set for 3 weeks away. The media descended on her like locusts. Elderly librarian breaks decade-long silence about police corruption. 85-year-old woman risks prison to expose trafficking network. The grandmother who knew too much. Sophie called 17 times, frantic and confused. Robert offered to pay for the best criminal defense attorney money could buy. Mrs. Delgado brought over enough food to feed an army, her eyes wet with worry and disbelief. But it was Catherine who stood beside her through it all, holding her hand through interviews, shielding her from reporters, and preparing her defense. We're going to argue that you were a witness who made a false statement under duress, that you believed you were protecting yourself and others from retaliation, and that you've now voluntarily come forward to correct the record, Catherine explained in her office. We'll emphasize your age, your clean record, your cooperation in exposing the broader conspiracy. The DA might be willing to reduce charges or recommend a suspended sentence. Or they might decide to make an example of me, Margaret said. To show that lying to police has consequences, no matter who you are. That's possible too, Catherine admitted. But Mom, I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to fight so hard. I know you will, sweetheart. But if I end up in prison, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let Sophie think less of me. Help her understand that sometimes good people make bad choices, and that what matters is finding the courage to make things right. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I never wanted to be the kind of grandmother she'd be ashamed of. She could never be ashamed of you. None of us could. Catherine pulled her mother into a hug. You're the bravest person I know. For days before Margaret's court date, she received an unexpected visitor. Elena Rodriguez stood on her doorstep, looking older than her 52 years but with a strength in her bearing that hadn't been there before. They stared at each other for a long moment before Elena stepped forward and pulled Margaret into a fierce embrace. I had to see you, Elena said. I had to thank you in person. They sat in Margaret's living room, the same room where her birthday party had been just 2 weeks ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. The police told me what you did, Elena said. How you broke into the warehouse, how you risked everything to find Miguel and his evidence. Margaret, you didn't have to do that. You could have just told them what you knew and let them handle it. No, I couldn't. Not after carrying this secret for so long. I needed to do something active, something real, to make amends. Margaret poured tea with shaking hands. I'm just sorry it took me 10 years to find that courage. 10 years ago, you were different. We both were. Sometimes it takes time to become the people we need to be. Elena sipped her tea, her eyes distant. I've been thinking a lot about that night. About the choices we all made, the silence we all kept. And I've realized something. What's that? We were all victims of the same system. Victor trafficked vulnerable people because he knew we had no power, no voice, no way to fight back. The corrupt police protected him because they profited from our silence. And you and I stayed quiet because we were afraid of the law, afraid of retribution, afraid that telling the truth would make things worse instead of better. Margaret hadn't thought of it that way, but Elena was right. They'd all been trapped in a system designed to keep them silent, to make them complicit in their own exploitation. But we're not silent anymore, Margaret said. And maybe that's what matters most. Maybe. Elena set down her tea and looked directly at Margaret. I'm going to testify at your trial. I'm going to tell the court exactly what I saw that night, that Victor had surrendered, that Harrison shot him anyway, that you were caught in an impossible situation and made the choice you thought would keep you safe. I'm going to ask the judge for mercy. Elena, you don't have to. Yes, I do. You gave me justice for Miguel. Now I'm going to do everything I can to give you justice too. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your forgiveness or your help. Maybe not. But you're going to get it anyway. Elena reached across and took Margaret's hand. We're both survivors of that night, Margaret. Both scarred by what happened. But we're also both fighters. And fighters stand together. 2 days before the trial, the district attorney's office called with an offer. Catherine delivered the news in person, her expression carefully neutral in that way lawyers had when they didn't want to influence their clients' decisions. They're offering a plea deal, Catherine said. If you plead guilty to one count of making false statements to investigators, they'll drop the obstruction and perjury charges. You'd receive a suspended sentence, no jail time, just probation and community service. Margaret's heart leapt. No prison. No prison. You'd have a criminal record, but you'd be free. Catherine paused. But there's a catch. Part of the deal is that you testify against James Harrison at his trial. You'd have to detail everything he did, everything he told you, everything you witnessed. That's not a catch. That's just the truth. I'm happy to testify against him. I know. But Mom, James's attorney is claiming that he's being scapegoated, that there are higher-level officials who should be charged but aren't. He's suggesting that the DA is going easy on you in exchange for your testimony because they want to close this case quickly without having to dig deeper into who else was involved. Margaret absorbed this. Do you think that's true? I think it's possible. Miguel's evidence names 17 people, but there could be more. And some of those people might have enough power to protect themselves. Catherine leaned forward. The question is, are you willing to take this deal even if it means some guilty people might go free? It was a good question. Margaret had spent 10 years protecting a murderer. Now she had the opportunity to help prosecute him, but only if she accepted that justice would be incomplete. What would happen if I rejected the deal? Margaret asked. You'd go to trial. We'd present your case, argue for leniency based on the circumstances. But there's no guarantee. You could be convicted on all charges. You could go to prison. And if I go to prison, if I'm not available to testify against James and the others, then the prosecution's case becomes weaker. They might still convict, but they might not. And the investigation into the broader corruption network might stall out. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at her quiet suburban street. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives, untroubled by questions of justice and complicity and the weight of impossible choices. She thought about Miguel Santos, who died fighting for truth. She thought about Elena, who'd survived and was willing to speak up. She thought about all the nameless, faceless victims of Victor's trafficking network who'd never gotten justice at all. And she thought about herself, an 85-year-old woman who'd spent 10 years as a coward and was finally being offered a chance at redemption, even if it was an imperfect one. I'll take the deal, Margaret said. I'll testify against James, and I'll tell the truth about everything. But I'm also going to keep pushing for the investigation to continue, to expose everyone who was involved. I'm not going to let this end with James taking all the fall while powerful people escape consequences. Catherine smiled, pride evident in her expression. I was hoping you'd say that. The night before Margaret was scheduled to accept the plea deal, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways her life had changed in just 3 weeks. At 2 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text message. Sophie ***, Grandma, are you awake? I need to talk to you ***. Margaret called her immediately. Sophie. What's wrong, sweetheart? Nothing's wrong. I've been thinking about everything that's happened. About what you did, about why you stayed silent. Sophie's voice was small, younger than her 23 years. And I want you to know that I'm not ashamed of you. I'm actually really proud. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Proud? Sophie, I lied to the police. I covered up a killing. You were scared. You were trying to protect yourself and the people you loved. And when you finally found the courage to tell the truth, even though it meant risking everything, you did it anyway. Sophie paused. That's the grandmother I know. The one who taught me that it's never too late to do the right thing. I wish I'd done the right thing 10 years ago. But you didn't have me 10 years ago. You didn't have Mom pushing you, or Elena giving you a reason. Maybe you needed all of this to happen exactly the way it did, so that when you finally spoke up, you could actually make a difference. Margaret had never thought of it that way, that her 10 years of silence might have been necessary, that the timing of her confession might have been exactly when it needed to be. Sophie, there's something I need to tell you. Tomorrow I'm going to court to accept a plea deal. I'm going to have a criminal record. People are going to know your grandmother is a convicted criminal. Good, Sophie said firmly. Let them know. Let them know that my grandmother is someone who made a mistake and then spent a decade carrying the weight of it. Let them know she finally found the courage to make things right. Let them know she exposed a trafficking network and helped bring down corrupt cops and stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher. Sophie's voice grew softer. Grandma, do you remember when I was 15 and I got caught shoplifting? I was so ashamed, so scared of what you'd think of me. And you told me that one mistake doesn't define a person, what defines us is what we do after the mistake. Margaret did remember. Sophie had stolen makeup from a department store on a dare, had been caught by security, had been devastated by the consequences. Margaret had held her while she cried and helped her understand that she could choose to learn from the experience or let it destroy her. I told you that mistakes are opportunities for growth, Margaret said. Exactly. So now I'm telling you the same thing. This mistake, this 10 years of silence, it's an opportunity. You're using it to grow, to become someone stronger and braver. And I'm here for all of it. After they hung up, Margaret finally felt sleep coming. But first, she did one more thing. She pulled out a notebook and began to write, not about the past, but about the future. About what she wanted to do with whatever time she had left, about how she could use her experience to help others facing impossible choices. She wrote until dawn, filling page after page with ideas, with plans, with purpose. The courtroom was packed. Margaret hadn't expected so many people, reporters, advocates, representatives from immigrant rights organizations, former students from her literacy classes, even some of her old colleagues from the library. And there, in the front row, sat Catherine, Sophie, Robert, and Elena, a united front of support. The judge was a stern-faced woman in her 60s named Ruth Blackwell. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite sympathy, not quite disapproval, something more complex. The prosecutor outlined the charges and the plea agreement. Margaret listened to her own actions described in legal language, hearing how small her lies sounded when reduced to counts and statutes, yet knowing how large they'd loomed in her conscience. Mrs. Winters, Judge Blackwell said when the prosecutor finished, I've read the details of this case with great interest. I understand that you're prepared to enter a guilty plea to one count of making false statements to investigators. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Margaret said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. And you understand that by pleading guilty, you're admitting that you knowingly provided false information during a police investigation 10 years ago? Yes, Your Honor. Before I accept your plea, I want to hear from you directly. Why did you lie, Mrs. Winters? And why are you coming forward now? It wasn't a standard question, but Margaret understood what the judge was asking. She was being given a chance to explain herself, to humanize the charges, to make the court understand. Margaret took a deep breath and began to speak. She told the truth, all of it. About Elena and her literacy classes. About Victor's trafficking operation. About the night in the warehouse when she'd witnessed things no person should have to see. About her fear of retaliation, her desperate desire to protect her family, her belief that staying silent was the only way to stay safe. I told myself I was protecting others, Margaret said, but really I was protecting myself. From consequences, from judgment, from having to admit that I'd witnessed a murder and done nothing. Every day for 10 years, I carried that weight. Every time I looked at my daughter or my granddaughter, I felt like a fraud. And what changed? Judge Blackwell asked. Why come forward now? Because the warehouse was being demolished, and I knew Miguel Santos's remains would be found. Because Detective Harrison came to me asking for help covering it up again, and I realized I couldn't do it anymore. But mostly. Margaret looked at Elena in the front row, at the strength and dignity in her bearing. Mostly because I realized that my silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was just allowing injustice to continue. And I decided I'd rather face consequences than live with that knowledge anymore. The judge was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Mrs. Winters, you're 85 years old. You have no prior criminal record. By all accounts, you've lived an exemplary life of service to your community. And yet you committed a serious crime, you lied to investigators in a homicide case, potentially obstructing justice. Margaret's heart sank. The judge was going to reject the plea deal, was going to send her to prison. However, Judge Blackwell continued, you've also voluntarily come forward, at great personal cost, to expose a trafficking network and police corruption. You've helped solve a 10-year-old missing persons case. You've given voice to victims who had no voice. And you've shown genuine remorse for your actions. The judge looked directly at Margaret. I'm going to accept your guilty plea, Mrs. Winters. And I'm going to follow the prosecution's recommendation for a suspended sentence. You'll serve no jail time, but you will be on probation for 3 years. You'll also be required to complete 200 hours of community service. Relief flooded through Margaret so powerfully she thought her knees might give out. But I'm adding one more condition, Judge Blackwell said. I want you to speak publicly about your experience. To schools, to community groups, to anyone who will listen. I want you to talk about the dangers of staying silent in the face of injustice, about the weight of carrying lies, about the importance of finding courage even when it's terrifying. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Yes, Your Honor. I'll do that. I promise. Good. Because your story matters, Mrs. Winters. Not just the part about the crimes you witnessed or the lies you told, but the part about finding redemption. We need more stories like that. As Margaret left the courtroom, surrounded by her family and supporters, she felt something she hadn't felt in 10 years, lightness. The weight was gone, lifted by truth and accountability and the grace of a judge who understood that justice wasn't just about punishment, but also about restoration. Elena grabbed her hand as they walked down the courthouse steps. You did it. You're free. We're both free, Margaret corrected. Finally. That evening, as Margaret sat in her living room surrounded by family, her phone rang. An unknown number. Mrs. Winters. This is Rachel Chen from the Immigrant Justice Network. We've been following your case closely, and we'd like to talk to you about working with us. Working with you how? We help immigrant communities navigate the justice system, especially in cases involving exploitation and trafficking. We think your story, and your willingness to speak truth about the ways systems can fail vulnerable people, could be incredibly powerful. Would you be willing to consider becoming an advocate? Margaret looked around at her family, Catherine beaming with pride, Sophie already pulling out her phone to document this moment, Robert raising his wine glass in a toast. She thought about Miguel Santos and his notebooks full of evidence, about Elena and her courage to survive and eventually speak out, about all the nameless victims who'd never gotten justice. Yes, Margaret said. I'd be willing. More than willing. Wonderful. We'd also like to discuss the possibility of using Miguel Santos's evidence to pursue civil cases against the remaining conspirators, the ones who haven't been criminally charged. It would be a long fight, probably years of litigation. But if we could win, we could establish precedents that would help protect vulnerable workers across the state. Years of litigation. Years of fighting for justice. Margaret was 85 years old, she might not have years left. But then again, maybe she did. And maybe, finally, those years would be spent on something that mattered. When do we start? Margaret asked. 3 months later, Margaret stood in front of a high school auditorium filled with students, their faces a mix of boredom and curiosity. It was her 5th speaking engagement since the trial, and she still felt nervous before each one. I'm going to tell you a story, she began, about an 85-year-old woman who thought she was a good person, right up until the moment she realized she wasn't. The students perked up. Nobody expected the sweet-looking old lady at the podium to say something like that. She told them about Elena, about Victor, about the warehouse. She told them about the choice she'd made to stay silent and the 10 years she'd spent living with that choice. She told them about courage and cowardice, about justice and complicity, about the difference between being good and doing good. The thing about silence, Margaret said, is that it feels safe. It feels like you're protecting yourself, protecting the people you love. But really, silence is just another name for complicity. Every day you stay silent about injustice, you're choosing to be part of the problem instead of part of the solution. A hand shot up in the back. A young girl, maybe 16. But what if speaking up puts you in danger? What if it costs you everything? It was the question Margaret had wrestled with for 10 years. It might, Margaret said honestly. Speaking truth can be dangerous. It can cost you relationships, opportunities, safety, freedom. But staying silent has costs too, costs to your conscience, costs to your integrity, costs to all the people who continue to suffer while you protect yourself. So how do you decide? The girl pressed. How do you know when it's worth it? Margaret thought about this. I think you have to ask yourself, can I live with staying silent? Can I look at myself in the mirror, can I sleep at night, can I face the people I love, knowing that I chose my own comfort over someone else's justice? And if the answer is no, then you speak up. Even if it's terrifying. Even if it costs you everything. Another hand. A boy this time. Did you regret it? Coming forward after all that time? Never, Margaret said firmly. Not for a single second. Even on my worst days, even when I thought I might go to prison, I never regretted telling the truth. Because for the first time in 10 years, I could look at my family without shame. For the first time in 10 years, I could sleep without nightmares. For the first time in 10 years, I was free. After the assembly, several students approached Margaret with questions, confessions, their own stories of times they'd stayed silent when they should have spoken up. She listened to each one, offered what wisdom she could, and gave them the contact information for resources that might help. One girl, a senior with dark circles under her eyes, hung back until the others had left. My uncle, she said quietly, not meeting Margaret's eyes. He's been inappropriate. With me and my cousin. We've never told anyone because he's important in our community, because our families depend on him financially. But after hearing you talk, Margaret felt her heart break and soar at the same time. You want to speak up? The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm so scared. But I can't keep living like this. You don't have to be alone in this, Margaret said, pulling out a card for the school counselor she'd met with before her talk. There are people who can help you, who will believe you, who will protect you. Speaking up doesn't mean you have to face this alone. The girl took the card with shaking hands. Thank you. Thank you for your story. Thank you for showing me it's possible. That same week, James Harrison's trial concluded. Margaret had testified, as promised, telling the court exactly what she'd witnessed the night Victor died and what James had confessed about Miguel's death. Elena had testified too, corroborating Margaret's account from her perspective on the warehouse floor. The defense had argued that James was a cop who'd made split-second decisions in dangerous situations, that he'd been trying to protect people, that his actions were justified under the circumstances. The prosecution had presented Miguel's evidence, showing a years-long pattern of corruption, of looking the other way, of accepting payments to allow Victor's operation to continue. They'd argued that James had murdered Miguel not in self-defense or in an accident, but deliberately, to protect his own criminal enterprise. The jury had deliberated for 3 days. Guilty. On all counts. James Harrison was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At 62, it was effectively a life sentence. Margaret felt no satisfaction in the verdict, only a deep sadness for everyone involved, for Miguel who died seeking justice, for the victims of the trafficking network, for James's family who'd lost a husband and father and grandfather to his own corruption, even for James himself, who'd started as a cop wanting to help people and ended as a criminal willing to kill to protect his secrets. After the sentencing, Margaret visited James in jail. She hadn't planned to, but something compelled her to face him one more time. He looked diminished in his orange jumpsuit, older and smaller than the imposing detective who'd shown up on her doorstep 3 months ago. "I didn't expect to see you," James said, sitting across from her in the visiting room. "I didn't expect to come," Margaret admitted. "But I needed to ask you something." "What? Do you regret it? Any of it? Or do you still think you were justified?" James was quiet for a long time. "I regret not having the courage to face consequences earlier. I regret letting my fear make me into a killer. I regret dragging you into this, making you complicit in my crimes." He looked up, and Margaret saw genuine pain in his eyes. "But do I regret stopping Victor? No. He was a monster. He was hurting people. Someone had to stop him. Someone did stop him. You did. But you didn't have to execute him, and you definitely didn't have to kill Miguel. I know. I know that now. But in the moment, all I could see was my own survival, my own protection. I couldn't see past my fear to the larger picture." James leaned forward. "You were stronger than me, Margaret. You carried the same secret, the same fear, but when the moment came, you chose truth over self-preservation. I wish I'd had that strength. You could have had it. You just had to choose it. I know. And now I get to spend the rest of my life living with the choices I made." James smiled sadly. "But at least the truth is out. At least Miguel's evidence is being used to help people. At least some good came from all this suffering." As Margaret left the jail, she felt a strange sense of closure. James would pay for his crimes. Miguel's death would have meaning. Elena had justice. And Margaret herself had finally found a way to transform her shame into purpose. 6 months after Margaret's trial, the Immigrant Justice Network held a press conference. They announced a major settlement in the civil case against the remaining members of Victor's trafficking network, business owners, landlords, and officials who'd profited from exploited labor. The settlement included financial compensation for victims, funding for legal services for immigrant communities, and new oversight mechanisms to prevent similar exploitation in the future. And standing at the podium, reading a statement on behalf of all the victims, was Elena Rodriguez. "For too long," Elena said, her voice strong and clear, "we have been invisible. Our suffering has been invisible. Our exploitation has been invisible. But today, we become visible. Today, our stories are heard. Today, justice is served." She talked about Victor's operation, about the fear and desperation that had kept workers silent, about the systems that had failed to protect vulnerable people. And then she talked about courage, the courage to speak up, the courage to demand better, the courage to believe that change was possible. "My friend Margaret taught me something," Elena said, looking directly at Margaret. "She taught me that it's never too late to tell the truth. That carrying shame and secrets only gives power to the people who hurt us. That speaking up, even when it's terrifying, is the only way to truly be free." The room erupted in applause. Margaret's journey from silence to truth changed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. When have you found the courage to speak up about something that scared you? Share your story in the comments. Your courage might inspire someone else. 1 year after Margaret's 85th birthday, the birthday that had started everything, she celebrated her 86th surrounded by family and friends, plus a few new additions. Elena was there, of course, along with her 3 adult children who'd flown in from Phoenix to meet the woman their mother spoke of so often. Representatives from the Immigrant Justice Network came, including several people who'd been helped by the precedent-setting settlement. Even some of Margaret's former literacy students showed up, now confident readers who wanted to thank the teacher who'd believed in them. And Sophie, her wonderful granddaughter, had created a video montage of Margaret speaking engagements, advocacy work, and media appearances over the past year. Margaret watched herself transform from a trembling, ashamed woman in a courtroom to a confident advocate speaking to packed auditoriums, news programs, and community organizations. To Grandma, Sophie said, raising her glass. "Who taught us that courage isn't about never being afraid? It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." Everyone drank to that. Later, after most of the guests had left, Margaret found herself on the porch with Catherine and Elena, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. "I got a call today," Catherine said. "From a publisher. They want you to write a book about your experience." Margaret laughed. Who would want to read a book about an old lady who lied to the police? Everyone, Elena said firmly. Because it's not just a story about lying. It's a story about finding redemption. About how it's never too late to change, never too late to do the right thing, never too late to make a difference. She's right, Catherine added. Your story gives people hope, Mom. Hope that they can overcome their mistakes, that they can find courage even when they're terrified, that speaking truth matters even when it's hard. Margaret thought about this. A book. Her story, told in full, available to anyone who might need it. Okay, she said. I'll do it. On one condition. What's that? Catherine asked. All proceeds go to the Immigrant Justice Network. To fund legal services, advocacy work, support for trafficking victims. Miguel's evidence started this fight, but we need resources to continue it. Elena smiled. Miguel would like that. Using words to fight for justice, that's what he did with his notebooks. Now you'll do it with your book. Margaret spent the next 6 months writing. She wrote about her childhood, her marriage to Thomas, her years at the library. She wrote about meeting Elena, about Victor's operation, about the night in the warehouse that had changed everything. She wrote about fear and shame and the crushing weight of silence. But she also wrote about redemption and courage and the liberating power of truth. The book was called, After Silence, One Woman's Journey from Complicity to Courage. It was published on the 2-year anniversary of Margaret's birthday confession, and it became an unexpected bestseller. Margaret used her platform to advocate for criminal justice reform, for better protections for immigrant workers, for resources to help people caught in impossible situations find the courage to speak up. She testified before the state legislature about the need for whistleblower protections. She consulted with police departments on creating systems that would encourage rather than discourage reporting of misconduct. And every month, she visited a different school or community group to tell her story, to encourage others to find their own courage, to remind people that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of complicity. On Margaret's 88th birthday, she received a letter. It was from a woman named Maria, who'd been part of Victor's trafficking network. She'd seen Margaret's book, had recognized the description of the operation, and had finally found the courage to come forward about her own experiences. I've been carrying this shame for 15 years, Maria wrote. Telling myself that I was weak, that I should have fought back, that staying silent made me complicit in my own exploitation. But reading your story helped me understand that surviving trauma doesn't make me weak. That the people who hurt me are responsible for their actions, not me for my silence. That it's never too late to speak my truth. Maria had filed charges against the man who trafficked her. She'd connected with the Immigrant Justice Network for legal support. She'd started therapy to process her trauma. And she'd written to Margaret to say thank you for breaking her own silence in a way that made it easier for others to break theirs. Margaret kept that letter on her nightstand, reading it whenever she doubted whether her confession had been worth the cost. 3 years after the night in the warehouse, Margaret sat in a courtroom once again. But this time, she wasn't the defendant. She was there to witness the sentencing of the last remaining member of Victor's network who'd been prosecuted, a businessman who'd knowingly employed trafficked workers in his factories, who'd paid bribes to keep inspectors away, who'd threatened workers with deportation if they complained. The prosecution had used Miguel's evidence to build their case. Elena had testified about her experiences. Margaret had provided expert testimony about the broader patterns of exploitation and corruption. And now, finally, this man was being held accountable. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison and ordered him to pay restitution to every worker who'd been exploited in his factories. As Margaret left the courthouse, she saw a group of those workers gathered on the steps, men and women who'd finally received justice, who'd been seen and heard and believed. One of them, an older man with calloused hands and kind eyes, approached Margaret. "Thank you," he said in heavily accented English. "Thank you for speaking. For making them listen." "I should have spoken sooner," Margaret said. "But you spoke. That's what matters. You spoke, and we are free." Margaret Winters passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 91, 6 years after she'd broken her 10-year silence. Her obituary in the local paper was brief: retired librarian, literacy advocate, and champion for immigrant justice. Survived by daughter Catherine, granddaughter Sophie, and countless lives she touched through her courage and compassion. But the real memorial came from the community she'd served. The Immigrant Justice Network established the Margaret Winters Truth and Justice Fellowship, providing funding and support for people who wanted to speak out against exploitation and corruption. The high school where Margaret had given her first speech created an annual Margaret Winters Courage Award for students who demonstrated exceptional bravery in standing up for what was right. Her book remained in print, assigned reading in ethics classes and law schools and advocacy training programs across the country. And most importantly, her story continued to inspire others to break their own silences, to find their own courage, to speak their own truths. On the 7th anniversary of Margaret's confession, Elena Rodriguez stood before a crowd at the dedication of a new community center in the neighborhood where she'd once been trafficked. This center, Elena said, is named in honor of two people who gave their lives fighting for justice. Miguel Santos, who documented the truth even when it put him in danger. And Margaret Winters, who finally spoke that truth even though it terrified her. The Miguel Santos and Margaret Winters Community Justice Center would provide legal services, advocacy support, literacy classes, and a safe space for immigrant communities, a living legacy of two people who'd refused to let fear silence them forever. Sophie was there, now 30 and a documentary filmmaker, working on a film about her grandmother's journey. Catherine was there, having left her private practice to work full-time for the Immigrant Justice Network. Robert was there, along with his and Catherine's 2 children, who'd grown up hearing stories of their brave great-grandmother. And as Elena pulled the cloth off the bronze plaque dedicating the center, as the crowd applauded and cheered, somewhere the spirit of Margaret Winters smiled. She'd stayed silent for 10 years, carrying the weight of shame and complicity and fear. But then she'd spoken. And her voice had echoed far beyond anything she'd ever imagined, inspiring others to find their own voices, to tell their own truths, to believe that it was never too late to choose courage over fear. Margaret had learned the hard way that silence was a prison. But she'd also learned that speaking truth, no matter how late, was the key to freedom, not just for herself, but for everyone whose voices had been stolen or suppressed or silenced by fear. In the end, that was the most important lesson of all. One voice speaking truth can inspire countless others. One person choosing courage can change the world. And Margaret Winters, who'd thought of herself as just an ordinary old woman, had done exactly that. The end. Margaret's story reminds us that our past mistakes don't have to define our future. No matter how long we've stayed silent, no matter how much shame we carry, it's never too late to speak our truth and make things right. If Margaret's journey touched you, if it made you think about your own silences, if it inspired you to find courage in your own life, please share this story. Someone else might need to hear it. Someone else might be carrying their own 10-year burden, waiting for permission to finally speak. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. And it's never, ever too late to use them. Thank you for listening to Margaret's story. May it give you courage for your own journey. Like this video if her story moved you. Comment below and share your thoughts. Would you have had the courage to speak up after 10 years of silence? What would you have done in Margaret's position? Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, emotional stories that will touch your heart and inspire you to live with courage and truth. Your support helps us continue bringing you these life-changing stories. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could change your perspective on life. Thank you for watching Margaret's incredible journey. May her courage inspire yours. See you in the next story.